Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm Dylan. I'm based in Arizona, though I lived in London for a few years, so I still have a lot of connections there. I thought I'd give a talk today that's a bit different. It's a bit tech, a bit history, and kind of a bit of like how to predict the future. I'm one of the creators of Dojo, which is one of the early JavaScript frameworks, which is now a TypeScript framework. I was a CEO at TypeN for nearly 20 years. I help organize TSConf and Halfstack, and I'm also working on a startup called LivingSpec. And what I think is really interesting is it's really easy now to say, hey, like this TypeScript thing, it's kind of big, right? And I just want to make sure I'm actually sharing the right screen, right? Everyone can see like the title slide? Yes?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, cool. And you know, what's interesting is like, well, how did it get popular and why? Because in like 8 years ago, Microsoft was not considered an open source friendly company. So like, why did I decide 8 years ago that TypeScript was a good thing? And I was sort of encouraged to give this talk by a friend who was like, you know, it's weird, like you're right about a lot of things. And I was like, well, what do you mean? And I like sort of rattled off some of these. And it's not that I'm right about everything, but like when I first saw the image tag in the Mosaic browser in '94, I'm like, oh, this web thing's going to be big. And people were like, yeah, why would I use the web when I can go talk to someone in person or when I can go to the library and read a book? Like that was the kind of feedback I got back then. Or I actually started working with JavaScript in '96, and people would be like, hey, go learn a real language like Java or C or, you know, something like that, right? And I predicted the dot-com bubble in '99, which a lot of people were predicting, but I actually was smart enough to sell off a bunch of equity at the time instead of watching it all crash down the next year. I was really passionate about SVG in 2001, which was about 10 years too soon. But I knew that like the ability to draw natively in a browser was a really big deal. I started a JavaScript framework with a few other people in 2004, which was a really good time to do that. But TypeScript was kind of surprising because I actually had a bad experience with Microsoft prior to that. And so it was not what you would expect. And so I think to sort of understand like why I sort of pick these things really early sometimes is to sort of look at the history of what was needed and where we were at and why this seemed like a really important thing to do. So to do that, you sort of step back to like '99, which is the really early years of JavaScript. You know, there's like the Y2K thing, like party like it's 1999. So here we're going to JavaScript like it's 1999. So at the time JavaScript was established, the browsers on the market were Netscape and IE. There were maybe other attempts, but those were really the two browsers, both browsers in the day, as we called it. And almost as soon as the language was released, all the discussions became, well, how do we fix this thing? How do we make it interesting? So there was this sort of grand vision for JavaScript 2.0, where we would add classes and typing and modifiers and this thing called E4X. And these were all things that were attempts to improve the language. But I like to describe those as JavaScript, where it was basically an attempt to like take all the stuff from Java and shove it into JavaScript. And people were taking the sort of Java part of it way too seriously. And like Google had this thing called GWT or GWT that would actually take Java code and transpile it to JavaScript. And it was great if you wanted to create applications that looked just like Gmail at the time. But otherwise, it was actually fairly difficult to work with. And we had this ES4 thing that was pretty complex, and it was kind of inspired by ActionScript from Flash, kind of inspired by these JavaScript efforts that were going on to make the 2.0 version. And it was championed by Adobe and Mozilla, and Microsoft and a few others kind of just looked at it and were like, this is too complex, this isn't going to work. And really everyone was attempting at the time to turn JavaScript into a real language, and it failed pretty miserably. And so in around 2008, I think if I remember correctly, Brendan Eich and some others got together and they came up with this idea of creating harmony. And the idea was to create ES5, which kind of standardized what everyone was doing at that time anyway. So basically throw away ES4. It's kind of like the iPhone 9, which never existed, just, you know, they skipped a version number, abandoned it. At the time, CoffeeScript was kind of emerging. It had some fixes for JavaScript. And it was kind of the first time people said, oh, I could write something that's sort of like JavaScript, but I'm going to get some nice syntactic sugar and I'm going to transpile it to JavaScript. So it was kind of like, oh, that's interesting. Like, do I really want to have to transpile to run something? And obviously that's proved to be successful. And honestly, we were still in 2008 and it was going to be 7 more years before ES6 would finally be released and finished. So it was a long process to try to get back some of these things that were proposed as early as 2000 or 1999. So you're probably like, hey, Dylan, like, I thought we were talking about TypeScript, like what's going on? And really what I'm just trying to do is like set the stage for the world in which TypeScript was born. Because a lot of the early thorns and challenges of TypeScript were the fact that it started before ES6 was a thing. So they adopted some concepts and they extended the language a bit in ways that were not compatible with what ES6 would end up doing. And a lot of the early perceptions were kind of like, oh, well, this is like a fork of JavaScript or a different language, rather than sort of aligning with the standards and adding the things that were needed. But that was born out of necessity before certain things were standardized into the language. And a lot of people, myself and teams at Microsoft and teams at a lot of other organizations, were trying to build very large applications with JavaScript. And it was really challenging because the language was not designed for it. And people, when they first hear about TypeScript, they think, oh, well, I got to define types like strings and numbers. And while that may be true, a lot of that can be inferred automatically. But what's really interesting about TypeScript to me, and what got me first interested in it, was the idea of interfaces. Because early in the days, I had tried to work on like a compatibility layer between Dojo and jQuery, or at least our Dojo team had tried to do this. And it was really difficult because there was no clearly defined interface for what jQuery provided and what it was. And the consequence of that was like every time jQuery upgraded, they would break something in a subtle way, not necessarily intentional, but just there's a lot of different ways you can use an undocumented dynamic API that doesn't have a lot of restrictions or definitions. So we always talk about like working with APIs, but JavaScript, it's actually really difficult to express the intent of your code or the API that you're working with. So TypeScript like forces you to do some stuff to describe definitions and interfaces or to types, but what that does, it allows you to describe the code you've built, which is really interesting. And then you get a bunch of nice things on top of that related to interoperability and other niceties to have. But what also is kind of cool about that is just that then you can start to like realize that TypeScript's not trying to replace JavaScript. It's trying to provide interfaces and types for JavaScript. And there have been many other languages that have come along that have tried to replace JavaScript, and such as Dart or other things. And they haven't really succeeded on the web because inevitably they're trying to change or replace this language that we all love, or whether we love it or not, like we all use it for the web. And one of the reasons TypeScript is actually kind of challenging to do and to make it really nice is that it is trying to do a type system that supports all the common ways that we use JavaScript in the world. And that's pretty interesting and challenging. So fast forward a bit, we're still in 2010, it's still like 10 years ago, which is hard to believe. And this is where you might expect me to show a picture of Anders Heilsberg, who's known for Turbo Pascal and Delphi and C# and TypeScript. But it turns out Anders wasn't actually the original creator of TypeScript. He just joined the project fairly early. And so what was going on is there was the Chakra team, these two people on the team, Steve Lucco and Luke Hogan, and they were tasked with coming up with an idea for managing large JavaScript code bases. At the time, there were a lot of different things at Microsoft that were starting to grow in size that were web projects, and they wanted to do something interesting. So they came up with this project called Strata, and I'm not sure how the name Strata first started. I've actually done a lot of interviews to try to find out information that's kind of not publicly known, which is kind of cool. But at the time, there was Bing Maps and Microsoft Office had a bunch of JavaScript extensions, and Visual Studio is trying to support JavaScript, and not really Clippy, but Clippy's kind of fun. And I like that version of Clippy. And what was happening is there were like VPs in Office at the Microsoft team, and they were trying to rapidly transition their development teams from C++ or C# over to JavaScript. And they were missing the productivity and confidence that type systems of those languages had. And the Visual Studio IDE had provided those for other languages, but it was not really able to do that for JavaScript at the time. But JavaScript was emerging as this language where people were building substantial applications, and yet they were missing the productivity features they had. And so at the time, there were several options available. There was CoffeeScript, which we already talked about. There was something called Script Sharp that was worked on internally at Microsoft. I think it was announced publicly, but it never really took off. But there was a bit of an impedance mismatch, if you were trying to get like teams working together and working in the same language. Also, what was kind of interesting at the time is there was Google's Clojure compiler, which is what this logo is on the right, I think. And basically the Clojure compiler was just a Java-based compiler that would allow you to transpile JavaScript. And a lot of JavaScript projects used it. Dojo used it and others as sort of a precursor to Webpack and Babel and things like that. But it allowed you to do some minification, some code mods, and it caught and reported type-based errors, which was kind of interesting. Even though most people didn't use it in that way, it was possible. And so there's just a lot of different interesting things going on. So the team at Microsoft sort of came up with a few founding principles for this Strata project. They wanted a language as similar as possible to JavaScript, in very few additions or changes. They wanted type checking and they wanted to support rich tooling. And one of the lessons learned sort of on the history of programming is like, why do people hate Java in the JavaScript community or in a lot of communities? And it's often not that it's Java, it's often that it's a slow experience in an IDE, that they haven't, at least early on, they didn't couple the developer experience and performance with the language features they were adding. So the sort of joke was like, as you're typing in Eclipse, like you're watching the compiler think instead of like working at the speed that you can work. And they didn't want to repeat that behavior. So they had a big internal conference at Microsoft in February of 2011. And this was, there's like no public info on this that I've found other than like maybe a blog post or two here and there. But it was kind of interesting. Like they're supposed to present this thing they'd been working on. And Steve, who was the only engineer on the project, had a wrist injury, so he couldn't actually write code for a while, and he was supposed to be hacking on it. So Luke kind of hacked something together without actually having a compiler, and he described it as like slightly better than vaporware, which is kind of funny. And the first users of this team that were working on it would become the later VS Code team. And so I think it's kind of fun to look at the first demo code that's been shared. And so if we look at this code, it's kind of funny. The first thing you realize up top is that there is jQuery. So they actually used jQuery in this demo just to like, I don't know why, like they just did it because it was a true like vaporware type thing. There were some implicit flow types through the code without the need for annotation. So you can kind of just see like some implicit typing. So they didn't have to define things explicitly. But then they also had some like this weird sort of class syntax that was sort of based on F# at the time, this like functional syntax. They kind of moved away from that. They also moved away from this concept of having like the type as a prefix instead of a suffix, because that didn't really work well with how JavaScript parsers work and so on. But a lot of it is actually pretty similar to what they do today. So you look at it and you're like, well, that's kind of like TypeScript, but it's not really, but it is similar enough. But they also made it work that like you could use plain JavaScript in this system from day one. And my understanding is that Anders was there on day one, and he was impressed enough or interested enough that he ended up leaving the C# team and joining the TypeScript team shortly thereafter to work on it. And so they went from sort of this side project interpreter that used Clojure compiler comments to pull this all together. Somehow the parser was hosted in Silverlight, like to make it run fast enough in a browser. So they demoed it like in a browser environment. And then they sort of had this live error reporting that worked through script tags as there's like this background type checker running in the browser. So it was like this really weirdly hacked together thing by a non-engineer to show a demo of something that could work that was impressive enough that people at Microsoft Research were like, oh, this could be really big. This could actually really work. So that was February 2011. Fast forward like 18 months, and there's a blog post announcing TypeScript. And Anders has a talk, and there's like a little video. And the comments on this post are priceless. I mean, they're like, this, like Scott Kuhn, I don't know Scott Kuhn, but he's just like, this is the dumbest idea ever. And you're like, oh, that's cool. It's almost as bad as the comments about React when that first came out, which was also equally deadpanned as well. This other person, Derek Bailey, was like, this is bad or worse than Dart. Like, all right. Like, it seems that Anders hates languages that aren't statically typed. And actually, it's not true at all. Anders loves very functional languages, but he's basically surprised that like people thought that about him, because what he's really just trying to do is actually add the ability to add interfaces and types to a language. Hold on one second. Hey, I'm on a conference call, okay? Thanks, bye. My son is 6 years old and doing homeschool right now. So there was also, I have to talk to you later. Thank you. I will lock the door now.
It's okay, Dylan.
It's all good. It's why it's what makes it fun and live and real, right? So,
yeah.
Anyway, so then like there's why another JS plus X language? It's kind of funny they use the phrase JS plus X because obviously JSX came out roughly the same time. It was kind of nice coincidence. And there was like one comment on the thread originally that was like, oh, this is actually like a really good idea. I like this, and I actually saw it. And to be honest, when I first saw this, I was a little skeptical, but I keep an open mind to things because I don't assume that I know everything. So a few days later, they were at JSConf.eu and they gave a talk about this. And it was like, if you look at it, it's like just a really low production quality talk. Like JSConf.eu was kind of a small thing. And last time I checked, this video had 15 likes and a couple of comments. And I think the reason no one has noticed it is because they misspelled Anders' surname and like the talk like metadata. So people just don't find it. I don't know how they don't find it, but like it's like the most underwatched talk for like the thing that kicked off a major change in the language. So since that time, a lot has changed. And what you'll notice is like the first 2 or 3 years, and this is just the Google Trends chart on top, the first 2 or 3 years was pretty quiet. And frankly, it's because TypeScript wasn't really done. It was like good enough that it should promise, but it was not like something you would use to create a framework at the time. It needed a lot of work. And what you also notice is kind of that inflection point starts around the time ES6 was done. So the sort of, it was kind of just a little bit ahead of its time with the public release. What you'll also notice is it like popped onto language popularity charts, and it's now considered like a top 10 programming language on its own, in addition to JavaScript, which is pretty shocking. I mean, I thought it would do well, but I never quite expected it to be as well received as it is today. So my personal history, before I sort of go into like the full history of TypeScript since then, in 2004, I was working on a project with Alex Russell, a predecessor to Dojo, called NetWindows. And Microsoft's lawyers decided to send every open source project with the word Windows in it a cease and desist order, except even though X Windows predated Microsoft Windows. And so we changed our project name and we started a new project called Dojo. But we kind of had some bad blood from that relationship because we didn't have money to defend a lawsuit over a name that had nothing to do with Microsoft Windows. So then, this thing came out from Microsoft, like open source software from Microsoft. That's funny. That's cute. Because to date, they'd had like these fake open source licenses called like the Microsoft shared source, which really meant like Microsoft owned everything except when they chose not to. But then I was in spring of 2013, so just a few months later, people kept asking me about it. So I was at a conference for ESRI, which is a big map technology company. And like, hey, have you checked out TypeScript? We're considering using it. And I'm like, oh, really? And then one of my fellow engineers at SitePen was like, hey, we should start using TypeScript. And I was like, all right, like convince me. And he basically showed me the benefits of it. And I was pretty quickly on board, but it still took us about 6 months to say, let's rewrite Dojo using TypeScript, which then became like a 5-year process to basically start over and start over again. And kind of one of the highlights for me was in summer of 2017, I was invited up to Microsoft and met the team, and Anders made time for us. And we just got to talk about what we needed. And it was really amazing experience because usually when you're invited to a session like that, my experience is like, yeah, you're there, but like, we're going to tell you what to think. And but they made compilers feel accessible to me. And like, I'm not a compiler person, but like the team knew how to communicate in a way that really made things approachable. And at lunch, they were like asking me like, how do you work remotely? And I was like, well, that's like so obvious. Like I've been doing it for 10 years. But for them, it was like this new concept because they all work together in an office, at least until this year, obviously. So it was a really nice meeting. And so in the early years of TypeScript, like there's a lot of promise, but the interest was kind of muted. And frankly, the compiler needed a lot of work. There was a quote somewhere about how generics probably weren't a good idea, but without generics, TypeScript would be impossible to define. But kind of the point when TypeScript became a real open source project to me is when they moved to GitHub. And obviously this is years before Microsoft would acquire GitHub. At the time they had something called Codeplex, which was kind of where all the fake open source projects went to live. But the switch to GitHub, I think, is kind of the point where people started to say, oh, Microsoft's actually going to do a real open source project here. This is pretty interesting. And between like 2012 and 2014, I think they rewrote the compiler like 2 or 3 times pretty significantly. And I think the world started to notice TypeScript around 1.4, because that is when the Angular team started to collaborate with the Microsoft team and say, let's not create our own fork of TypeScript, but let's improve TypeScript enough that Angular could use it and make it work. So Angular announced their switch to TypeScript around spring of 2015. TypeScript 1.5 had support for experimental decorators because Angular was doing this annotation-like thing, which is very similar. And then what was interesting is they just kept iterating on features that were important. And what they were stopping doing was really extending the language. They got involved with TC39. They started implementing all the ES6 features that were missing from TypeScript to date. And they basically said, we're not going to invent new language features. Like, we've already got too many. We want to remove as many of them as possible, but we don't want to compete with the language that's being defined, that's going in a direction that is aligned with TypeScript. And so then the next couple of years, it really became sort of mainstream popular, like Angular 2 shipped, which was kind of the first big framework that shipped with TypeScript support. Honestly, it was pretty rough. I think Angular 2 probably should have been called alpha rather than beta or final. And it's a few years really before that became finalized. And part of that is ES6 was a huge change, and then TypeScript was a huge change. So to think that you would know like the full ergonomics of a complex application framework 6 months to a year after those frameworks had been finalized is pretty optimistic, right? Because we didn't know like how people would actually use arrow functions. In 2015, everyone said, that's horrible. Why would you ever use that? And now arrow functions are like something we're used to and we're comfortable with. So there was a point also where we felt like TypeScript wasn't quite ready, but with TypeScript 2.2, we were able to say, okay, this mostly works for Dojo. Now we can rewrite Dojo for like the 20th time and find a nice framework approach that works. So then, we're 5 years after TypeScript's first been announced. And at this point, the release cadence improved. And I should step back a little bit. There was a stretch around 1.4 where TypeScript hadn't said anything or released anything in like 6 months. And I wrote kind of a nasty email because we had made the commitment to like fully reinvest, building Dojo on top of TypeScript. And I was like, are you guys going to fix your stuff? Or do we need to fork TypeScript? And I didn't mean it like seriously, but I'm like, but it kind of like inspired them to like get more public with their plans. And it turned out they were doing a major rewrite of their compiler. So of course they were kind of quiet about it. But at that point forward, I'd like to think I had at least a small part of them becoming much more public with their roadmap and much more regular and consistent with their releases. Because prior to that, it was kind of a black box, which wasn't how I would normally run an open source project. And today, I think they're one of the best JavaScript communities out there in terms of, open source communities out there in terms of communicating with users, setting a clear intention, having a predictable roadmap, knowing what's going on, and so on. So they've made a lot of small improvements over the years, but every release, like the joke is TypeScript doesn't follow semantic versioning because every version will break you in some new way. And that's intentional because what they're trying to do is help you fix different problems that you didn't identify as possible issues before. So for the language to become more and more useful, it has to keep adding new features that would potentially break you. In March of 2018 was the first TSConf. That was a pretty awesome event. And that's also when Stencil was introduced, which is a really nice TypeScript-based web component generator or framework that helps you build components across frameworks. Dojo 2 finally shipped. We didn't take quite as long as Duke Nukem Forever or other games that took like 5 to 10 years or 15 years to be produced, but we wanted to be sort of this TypeScript first framework that was really ergonomic and efficient. And like if you squint, we look like a React-based, like a TypeScript version of React that kind of combines things together. In many ways, Next and Dojo are fairly similar in their depth and breadth. The only difference is that Dojo kind of controls the entire layer a bit more so that the framework can actually work with components a bit more efficiently, in our opinion. And so when TypeScript 3 came out, that was a big performance improvement for bigger projects. And that was kind of the point in time where, again, TypeScript would have another inflection point in terms of adoption and usage. And then shortly thereafter, Vue announced they're going to rewrite in TypeScript. And like Dojo, that's been a long slog. They were 2 years in and still haven't shipped. Babel 7 supported TypeScript. Create React Apps started adding support for TypeScript. Svelte 3 was rewritten in TypeScript. And so a lot of projects and framework authors were finding this is really nice because guess what? Like we can define interfaces for what we're building. So that's why it's particularly useful. there a lot of other interesting things happened. And this is kind of the point in time when like the survey results went from like, I haven't tried it, so I'm going to use it. And for whatever reason, like winter break 2018, my Twitter stream was filled with like never TypeScripters suddenly saying, I tried TypeScript and I love it. And so like Mike Sharov was like just shocked at like, wow, like this is like something magical that actually fixes my code for me and lets me refactor. And the like thought space around like people I knew and respected in the JavaScript ecosystem who had dismissed it before suddenly were like, oh, wow, this is kind of cool. Maybe I should be doing this. Then over the past couple of years, just a lot more features have happened. The second TSConf happened. Jest switched from Flow to TypeScript internally, which shocked a lot of people because Flow was kind of the main contender for TypeScript at the time. A lot of features like that finally fixed some complex things, like nullish coalescing support was and optional chaining was something that the TypeScript team helped work on, and they were one of the first people to implement it. And then they actually championed the private field support, which is kind of cool. They put a lot of work into that. I think that was the first feature that TypeScript team collaborating with Bloomberg actually went to TC39 and championed the spec and worked through all the issues from kind of the stage 0 to stage 4 process, which is pretty cool. And then this year, I mean, obviously it's a year of COVID, so things are a little more muted in general. TSConf is going to be online, but 4.0 just came out, I think it was last week, so it's pretty recent. And also very recently, it was announced that Svelte, while it was written in TypeScript before, it was still difficult to use with TypeScript without having to pull together like 20 different extensions. But a couple of the engineers in the TypeScript team worked with Svelte to improve the TypeScript support. So there's a lot going on, right? And so they're kind of constantly releasing things based on feedback, based on performance, based on people complaining, and they just kind of keep working every couple months to make the language better and the experience better. So really a lot has changed in the 7 years since it was announced, or maybe 8 years, and like the 9 to 10 years it's been worked on. Perceptions mostly went from being really negative to being, depending on the survey, like the second or third most loved programming language out there. And I think a huge amount of that is due to the care and attention the TypeScript team took to engage the ecosystem, delivering features within IDEs that are fast. Like Anders will not implement a feature in TypeScript or refuses to consider it if you can't find a way to make it as fast as you can type. And so that's a pretty important, and by type, I mean typing with your hands, not defining type definitions. And so, while Scott Kuhn's quote is probably going to go down in infancy, and I'd be curious to, or infamy, I'd be curious to see what he thinks today. That's kind of gone up in flames. And now, like, this is serious loved programming language. It's pretty impressive that it's happened. And a lot of it is like their true open source project. They've created an open and transparent roadmap. They're very engaged with the community. They truly have not tried to replace, which was Microsoft was known for like embrace, extend, extinguish. And they so far, and like from all we can tell, that's not the plan. And they've really taken care to make sure that they add features people want and in the way people would use. And so like, because TypeScript fixed a problem I saw in JavaScript, I was impressed and I thought it was going to be very useful. I knew it had lots of issues and lots of warts that needed to be worked on, but it seemed like a good project. So like looking back, I mean, it seemed like it was a bet, but it was a bet based on I have this problem and this pain point and this need. And it's amazing that someone's trying to solve it in a way that's consistent with the way JavaScript works, rather than trying to solve it in a way that is like, let's create a new language and let's just replace JavaScript. Because like that's the situation where you fix 5 problems and introduce 20 new ones by not really thinking through everything that a language does that's as powerful as JavaScript and its place within the web ecosystem. So that is it. So thank you. And I would love to hear your questions, and thanks.
Thank you very much, Dylan. Obviously, the first question has to be, how is teaching your son TypeScript going?
We actually got a Johnny 5 Inventors Kit recently, which sort of uses Tessel and Node, and we've started with JavaScript, obviously. About his most excitement, he's 6. His most excitement with JavaScript right now is this Lego JavaScript thing I built for him.
Oh, cool.
And you can like do this with TS and whatnot.
Yeah.
But we've been spending like an hour or so each Sunday just kind of trying to like get like sensors to light up and measure things. And I kind of try and walk it through him. I think mostly right now he's excited about making YouTube videos about it. But like, I figure eventually it'll stick. But I have this photo of him when he was like 2 years old, like hacking on my computer, like he was actually contributing to Dojo. But
Nice.
I think he's pretty interested in like the results. He's just not interested in like the work to get the results yet.
Yeah, but my kid's got this Lego boost thing.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
cool.
Yeah.
Code.
Yeah. I was expecting the tabs versus spaces question first.
Oh, last second. It's all right. Your son interrupted your talk, so that became more important. So, tabs versus spaces.
Well, obviously the troll answer is 3 space indentation. Not really. So ignoring all the like technical legacy reasons for why spaces are better, and obviously you can configure prettier to however you want. So for my open source stuff that I work on with Dojo, we use tabs. And the reason I prefer tabs, like if I have a prettier configuration, I show tabs in my IDE. And then I just, if I have to contribute back to spaces, it'll get handled for me with a commit hook or whatever. Because on different screens, I want a different depth of indentation. And so sometimes I'm working at sort of a different aspect angle. And so like if I'm on a pretty small screen on my laptop, I want my indentation as tight as possible. But right now at home, I have a 49-inch screen. So I kind of want some depth. And so when I use tabs, I can actually configure the distance, the width of my tab more easily than I can configure the width of a space. So there's like actual like a usability reason for me. I find it more readable when it's wider, when it's on a bigger screen.
Cool.
But prettier is of course the answer. So, but you can configure prettier, which is what people like. You could set tabs in prettier if you want to.
But how do you handle pull request reviews with the whole like tabs? So never mind. TypeScript is owned by Microsoft. Do you think it might be better placed if it was run by the OpenJS Foundation?
I feel like they have done everything right in treating it like a real open source project. So a lot of times a foundation emerges because like, why did Node create the Node Foundation, which then merged with the OpenJS Foundation? Because there was actual conflict and ownership issues and trust issues. And like the IP was technically sold by Ryan Dahl to Joyent, which was kind of weird. And so there were forks of the project and real tension from progress or lack thereof. And that hasn't happened in TypeScript to date. So it hasn't been an issue, but like open source foundations are supposed to be there to solve those problems. Now that said, like Microsoft contributes a lot of effort and time to the foundation. So it doesn't mean they won't do it someday, but it just hasn't been a problem. So I guess what I'm trying to say is like foundations are there to sort of help you when you have a problem, or maybe a little bit before you have a problem, but they've had so few problems that I wouldn't say it's like a necessity, but it's certainly an option if they want to consider it.
Very cool.
Yeah.
What kinds of apps do you think of TypeScript is better for building? I.e., when would you choose TypeScript over JavaScript or JavaScript over TypeScript?
I mean, I tend to never really get involved with anything small. So I almost always use TypeScript because you never really know where it's going to go. And I mean, the thing is, you end up with JavaScript that is similar to what you would write by hand anyway. So you could always drop it. And if you use allow.js as a configuration option in your TypeScript, you can just write plain JavaScript and use the TypeScript tools to sort of give you some suggestions on how to make your code better anyway. So I don't really see it as having to be a decision anymore. Whereas it used to be like, okay, if you want to use TypeScript, you got to upgrade your whole code base and use it, or you got to be strict with your types. But now you really can just like incrementally adopt it as you need it to. I find I can never remember why I did something 6 months earlier. So like just having the interface definitions really saves me time from reasoning about what I did. So for me, it's just like a memory tool more than anything else.
Cool. So as he's on this call, I have a colleague who thinks that using TypeScript will slow him down. What would you say in response to this argument and to argue against that?
I mean, at first, anything new slows you down. So when you switched from ES5 to ES6, I'm sure you were slowed down a lot. I actually had a colleague who was first working with us on Dojo. And he's like, I hate all these new features in TypeScript. I'm like, oh, what do you hate? And he's like, well, I hate arrow functions and I hate like this and I hate that. And it turned out everything he hated was actually ES6 features that he wasn't familiar with. And so what I'm reminded of is a lot of it is familiarity. Now, there are certain cases where it's difficult to describe an API and what it's doing. And at that point in time, you kind of make one of three decisions. You decide, like, this is really important. We better figure out the right way to describe it through an interface or a type definition. You decide you don't care and you just throw in any type on it, which is kind of what some people do. Or you realize that maybe this isn't the right way to write this API. Maybe there's a cleaner way to describe it that's easier to describe. So maybe I don't want like the full flexibility JavaScript wants because people aren't going to be able to understand what I did. So there's sort of this thought that like there are certain things that are difficult to describe with TypeScript because they're bad ideas. And all three of those answers are right depending on the scenario. And you just have to like decide when you care. But like if you really don't want to write TypeScript, like you could still use the allow.js flag and it would still tell you things about your JavaScript code that maybe you could improve. So it's not like you have to like fully embrace TypeScript and like how to like perfectly generic tuple variadic whatevers and like, you know, do like complex generic statements to like describe in infinite detail how your type definitions work. You could skip all that, but you could still get some benefit from the productivity tools they've provided.
Cool. To what extent do you think types reduce the need for unit tests?
There's a class of things where you're trying to determine if something is the type you expected, or where you're trying to like make sure that you're not doing like weird things you shouldn't be doing that TypeScript kind of gets rid of, because it is effectively like TypeScript is a linting tool, a testing tool, and a way to describe interfaces. And most of that is masked in the form of some language features, and then a whole bunch of compiler and language and build tools behind the scenes. So like to think of it as just like a new language or an addition to the language, actually the fact that there are any language additions or features are just there because like you can't do those things with normal JavaScript. But most of the benefit is actually not the syntax. Most of it is the tooling and process behind it.
Okay, cool. I think it's the last question. So what do you think are TypeScript's weaknesses and what would you improve?
I think that there are still some obscure things that are difficult. So all right, so like 3 or 4 years, or maybe 6 years ago now, there are like some of the earliest TypeScript issues were around this concept of variadic kinds, which is how you describe like basically higher order functional programming constructs. And the challenge originally behind those is they're really hard to describe something that's like infinitely functional, which is what you would get into. And Anders describes this as like turtles all the way down. And like if you go too many levels deep, your compiler starts to get really slow. So most compilers cheat and they go like 10 levels down, but there's certain things where that doesn't quite work. And so what they've been doing over the past couple of years is kind of chipping away at those problems and like figuring out like, okay, how do I describe this kind of like the variadic tuple implementation in TypeScript 4 was one of those big additions where before it was like this ugly set of like nested overloaded constructors. And now it's like a nice single generic that describes like, if you take two arrays and merge them together into a single array using concat, that's actually really hard to describe a flexible type definition for it. So there are still a handful of things like that are a lot of like, you know, like Ramda or other sort of functional libraries use that are hard to do. Like Lodash was particularly hard to type in TypeScript. It's still, I think it's better now, but there's still some things you can't efficiently type. So that's kind of where it is. And then really just once in a while, you just run into something where you're like, I don't get what this error is. Their error messages have gotten a lot better over the years, but there's still some cases where you're just trying to wrap your head around like what's going on, and that can be challenging. But I think that's true regardless of like, it's just complex code that's hard to describe at times.